My name is Ruby. I'm 34 years old. I'm the daughter of a woman my family once called the stain on our bloodline. I was raised in the silence of rejection, through family gatherings where my name was never mentioned, through phone calls that only asked how much money I could transfer. This Christmas Eve, I sat at the dining table inside the grand old Lockwood estate, the same one that once belonged to my great-grandfather who built the multi-million-dollar trust fund the entire family still lives off. I stayed quiet until Aunt Clarissa raised her glass and spoke in a voice as sharp as a razor. You've always been the biggest disappointment in this family. Just as useless as your mother was. Awkward chuckles fluttered around the table. The familiar blade cut deeper than ever. I tightened my grip on my wine glass, stood up and spoke each word clearly. Then I suppose everyone would like to know why I just froze the trust fund your daughter is using for her college tuition. The silence that followed was colder than the snow outside. Have you ever been humiliated in front of your own family, right there among the people who've looked down on you your entire life? And if in that moment you had the power to flip the entire table, would you do it? Leave a comment if you've ever felt underestimated in your own home. Tap like if you understand the pain of being treated like an outsider. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel because what happened after that moment was just the beginning. I was born in Maine in a small house tucked behind a grove of blazing red maples every fall, where my mother, Karen, once lived quietly after being cut off by the Lockwood family. She had once been the jewel of the family. The youngest daughter of the Lockwoods, top of her class, gentle in nature and favored by my grandfather, the man who founded the Lockwood Trust. He had even hoped she'd someday help manage part of the family operations. But then she got pregnant at 20, by someone who wasn't acceptable. No one in the family ever spoke his name. From that moment on, my mother became the thorn in their side. Clarissa, my mother's oldest sister, was the one who lit the match. I heard stories that she once stood in the family living room and said word for word, "Not a single cent of father's trust will go to a woman who can't keep her dignity." My mother was thrown out of the ancestral house that winter. I hadn't even been born yet and I was already destined to be the outsider. She never told me much about those early years after being cut off, but I knew they were hard. She worked as a bookkeeping assistant by day and took on small business accounting jobs at night just to support me. No one helped. But she lived with integrity and taught me that honor doesn't come from a last name. It comes from how you live every day. I never once saw her cry. Until one summer morning in the hospital when she held my hand tightly, her voice unusually weak. "I'm sorry I brought you into this world too soon, Ruby." I was 19 then. I could only bury my face into her shoulder and sob. 3 weeks later she passed away from pancreatic cancer. At her funeral, not a single Lockwood showed up. No flowers. No card. No message. I stood by her photo, heart turned to stone. From that day on, I was no longer anyone's daughter. I did every job I could to survive. Selling used books, waitressing at diners, tutoring high school math, anything to afford community college. But in those toughest years, I started learning about investing. At first, it was tiny steps. $300 for shares in a local software company. 6 months later, that tripled. I didn't use the profit to buy new shoes or upgrade my phone like my friends. I bought more shares. I read investment books every night. I studied fund management like my life depended on it, because it did. At 25, I opened an investment account under the name Ruby K. and began catching the attention of senior advisors. No one knew who Ruby K. was. No one realized the girl renting a studio apartment in North Boston, who used to make sandwiches part-time, was now behind a string of wildly successful venture capital deals. I learned to speak less and listen more. Most of all, I learned never to reveal my roots. The Lockwoods continued their flashy lives. The local press occasionally featured their charity events, Clarissa's golf tournaments, the Ivy League acceptances of her grandchildren. They never once mentioned me. And I never asked for anything. Until the day I stumbled upon a tiny legal notice in the Regional Financial Bulletin. The Lockwood Trust will initiate a review of successor trustee rights due to expiration of the original trustee's transitional clause. My heart stopped. I remembered my mother's words before she died. You don't need their permission to exist. You just need to wait for the right moment. I never understood her then. But now I did. My mother, the one they cast out, had once been my grandfather's most trusted confidant. And he had signed a secondary trustee clause to her, in case the primary successor failed to uphold ethical standards. That clause was a weapon they had no idea I was holding. I submitted my claim for identity verification. My attorney authenticated the still valid provisions in the original will. 3 months later, I received the official document. Ruby Karen Lockwood, legally recognized secondary trustee of the Lockwood Trust. Around the same time, I discovered the ancestral home had been quietly listed as collateral for an undisclosed loan. I didn't hesitate. I bought it outright and transferred the deed to an LLC I created in advance. I didn't hold a grudge. But I didn't forget. And I was ready. When Clarissa sent the Christmas party invitation with the added note, "If you'd like to join us, please bring a proper gift," I knew my moment had come. I chose a deep wine red dress, classic cut, hair in a soft updo, black heels just high enough to look elegant without wobbling. I didn't want to stun them. I wanted them confused. And confused they were when I walked through the doors of the ancestral house, the one they'd once kicked my mother out of nearly 40 years ago. I looked at the portraits on the walls, those same faces who ignored me at my mother's funeral, now smiling under golden lights. And I sat down quietly, until Clarissa opened her mouth. "You've always been the biggest disappointment in this family. Just as useless as your mother was." They laughed. I stood. And the storm began. No one in that room knew what was happening. They stared at me, half-full glasses in hand, polite smiles freezing in place. Clarissa was the first to speak, though her voice shook slightly. "What nonsense are you spouting, Ruby?" She set her glass down. Her eyes narrowed. "The Lockwood Trust is for family, those who've actually contributed." I met her gaze. "You're right. And I'm here to confirm that from this point forward, all disbursements from the trust will be reviewed under the ethical clause my great-grandfather signed. Clause 16 specifically, which states that if the primary trustee fails to uphold moral standards in asset management or misuses funds, the secondary trustee will be activated." "Who do you think you are?" my cousin Rachel snapped, her voice sharp. "You've been living out of state for what, over a decade? No one even knows what you do, and now you're barging in here stirring chaos." I turned to her. "I'm not stirring chaos. I'm executing my lawful authority. And if anyone has concerns, they can contact the Law Office of Fisherman Row, which currently holds all the court-certified documentation." Aunt Clarissa flushed. "That's ridiculous. I've been overseeing this fund for over 20 years. There's no clause that grants authority to an outsider like you." I reached into my handbag, pulled out a folder, and opened it to the last page, sealed in red. "This is the updated will from 1992, the version my mother kept intact for more than 2 decades. It's been verified and updated according to Maine state law." Rachel leaned forward to catch a glimpse, then slumped back in her chair. My cousin Michael stayed silent. His wife, Susan, looked at me with confusion written all over her face. The room fell into a silence that wasn't due to a lack of things to say, but because everyone was afraid to say the wrong thing. Aunt Clarissa tried to hold herself together. "So what did you come here for today? To threaten the whole family?" I slowly set the folder on the table, my voice calm. "I came here because of family. I've waited 15 years for a seat at this table. I didn't come to threaten anyone. I came to put an end to a system where toxicity is disguised as tradition." No one responded. I took my seat and calmly picked up a piece of turkey, as if I had just wrapped up a simple administrative task. Only my cousin Lucas, Aunt Clarissa's youngest son, spoke up, his voice dripping with contempt. "You really are the kind of person who uses the law to walk all over others." I set down my fork. "No, Lucas. I'm using the law to protect the values our great-grandfather left behind. And if that makes anyone feel hurt, maybe they should take a good look at how they've been living." Aunt Clarissa stood. "I don't need to hear any more of this. She stepped away from the table, her heels clacking against the hardwood floor like a drumbeat. But she didn't leave the room. She stood by the window, her back turned, shoulders trembling slightly. I turned to face the rest of my cousins. Did you know that last year, nearly $180,000 were disbursed for special administrative expenses? Meanwhile, the scholarship fund for underprivileged students in the county had just $8,000 left. Rachel whispered, "I didn't know." "No one did," I said. "Because internal audits have been delayed for years. And because no one dared ask. Or no one wanted to." Susan spoke up. "Ruby, are you saying you're going to change everything?" I nodded. "No one's being excluded. But everything must be transparent. Starting today, every expense must be approved by a board. And I will release a quarterly financial report, publicly. Anyone who doesn't want to participate has the right to decline support." Michael looked at me for a long time, then turned to Susan. I couldn't hear what they whispered, but when he turned back to me, his tone had shifted completely. "If what you're saying is true, then Aunt Clarissa has violated the fund's charter." I said nothing. Then from by the window, Clarissa's voice broke the silence, hoarse and strained. "Can you imagine, Ruby, living your whole life in a house, nurturing an entire family, only to be betrayed at the dinner table by the daughter of your sister?" I looked at her. "I'm not betraying this family. The way this family treated my mother, treated me, and treated True Values, that's the real betrayal." She turned around, her eyes red but her head still held high. "You think being in charge of the fund is glorious? It's a burden. A responsibility. You don't understand." I interrupted, gently but firmly. "You're wrong, Aunt. I do understand. Being the child of someone who was cast out, that's one kind of burden. Supporting yourself since the age of 19, that's another. But the one thing I've never carried is shame." The room went quiet once again. Then Charlotte, Rachel's 15-year-old daughter, shyly asked, "Aunt Ruby, so does that mean the fund belongs to you?" I smiled gently. "No, sweetie. I'm just the one standing in for our great-grandfather, to make sure it doesn't get twisted." Outside, snow had begun to fall. I could feel the mood in the room shifting. Not quite acceptance yet, but no longer entirely hostile either. I knew there was still much to face. But that evening, in the warm glow of the fireplace, I sat at the Lockwood family table for the first time, no longer the girl left out of the frame. I received the invitation on a December morning, just as Boston welcomed its first snowstorm of the season. The envelope was ivory white, the handwriting neat and formal, and the message read clearly, "Ms. Ruby Lockwood is cordially invited to attend the traditional Lockwood Christmas dinner at the Lockwood estate, December 24th at 5 p.m. There wasn't a single line of warmth. No apology for 15 years of silence. I stood in my kitchen, the card in my hand, my heart as still as the snow outside. At the bottom of the letter, there was one final line written in blue ink. "And if you choose to show up, bring a proper gift." Your mother never understood that. No signature. But I didn't need one. I knew that handwriting too well. Aunt Clarissa, the same woman who once called my mother a disgrace to the family, who excluded me from every family event, now writing me a message laced with condescension, as if offering me a chance to earn back some honor. Proper gift? I smiled. 3 weeks earlier, no one in the family knew that I had quietly purchased the Lockwood estate, the ancestral home they had been secretly mortgaging in exchange for an unsecured loan. The finance firm handling their accounts had listed the house on a private system, available only to pre-approved investors. I was one of them. I had no intention of living in it. But I knew to them the Lockwood estate wasn't just property, it was a symbol. The last thing they could cling to in their fantasy of being a proud, untarnished lineage. They didn't sell it for money. They sold it because they had no choice. And I bought it, not for revenge but to hold the key they hadn't yet realized they had lost. The invitation arrived 1 week after the deal closed. Maybe they had found out. Maybe they just sensed something was shifting out of their control. Either way, the invitation didn't come because they missed me. It came because they couldn't not invite me anymore. I took a few days to decide before accepting. Marcus, my boyfriend, looked at me as I shared the story of the invitation. You're really going to go? I nodded. For the last time. But not to bow my head. You don't have to prove anything, he said softly. They don't have the right to hurt you anymore. I held his hand, my voice steady. I'm not going for their approval. I'm going so they no longer assume my silence is consent. I chose a wine-colored silk dress, ankle-length, elegant but modest. My hair in a clean bun, a pair of tiny pearl earrings that once belonged to my mother. I wanted them to see me, not to impress them but so they could no longer pretend I didn't exist. On the afternoon of the 24th, I drove back to the old estate. Snow blanketed the tiled rooftops, and the pine trees flanking the gate were lit with traditional golden string lights. The house looked exactly as it did in my childhood memories, back when I used to secretly follow my mother here, standing from a distance, peering through the towering fence just to catch a glimpse of a world I was never allowed to enter. I was the owner of that house. But they still thought they were welcoming me as a stranger. Aunt Clarissa opened the door. She wore a black dress with a classic pearl necklace, her face carefully made up, lips tightening the moment she saw me. "Oh, you really came," she said, her voice barely hiding the surprise and unease. "I wasn't sure you had the courage." I handed her a neatly wrapped gift box with a small envelope on top. "A proper gift, just as you requested." She took it and nodded slightly. "I'll place it under the tree. Everyone's in the living room." The room glowed with lights. Familiar, but distant faces all turned toward me at once. Rachel was talking about her daughter receiving a full-ride scholarship from the Lockwood Trust. Michael stood by the fireplace holding a glass of red wine, talking about some business venture that everyone could guess had already failed. My youngest cousin Lucas was showing off a new watch, likely an early treat from the expanded scholarship fund I had just suspended. I walked in with a polite smile, received a few lukewarm hugs and chilly greetings. Susan, Michael's wife, leaned in to whisper, "Haven't seen you in a while. I heard you're doing something with design." "Venture capital," I replied with no need to explain further. She nodded, but her eyes had already wandered off. Aunt Clarissa raised her glass of red wine. "Let's raise a toast to a peaceful new year and especially to family, to the time-honored traditions no one can ever replace." The whole room lifted their glasses. I said nothing. I just watched. 15 years ago, I didn't have a seat at this table. 15 years later, I owned the entire house. But what I wanted wasn't to take over anyone's place. It was to make them see that the world didn't revolve around the center they drew for themselves. And as dinner began, as the room filled with the sound of forced laughter, I knew that the gift I brought wasn't under the tree. It was in the words I was about to say, every one of them, spoken at the very table they thought belonged solely to them. As I sat down on the wooden chair by the dinner table, between the clinking of silverware against porcelain and fragmented conversations, I felt myself sinking into a current of memory I couldn't resist. There were things I once thought had long been put to rest, but today, surrounded by this house, these walls, and all these calculating stares, my mother's image came alive more vividly than ever. I still remember that autumn afternoon clearly. My mother was sorting through thick financial files she always brought home after hours. The golden sunlight streamed through the window, brushing over her dark brown hair with a gentle glow that made her look like a portrait from another era. I was 17, sitting at the table pretending to do homework but really just watching her. "Mom," I asked softly, "have you ever wished you could go back to your old family?" Her hand paused midair, the red pen halting on a number. She didn't answer right away. She simply poured more tea and returned the pot to its place, slowly enough that I could feel the weight of the silence. "I don't want to go back," she said, her voice low but firm. "But I regret not telling you clearly where you came from." I looked up. She gazed at me, her eyes holding a depth I had never seen before. "Ruby, you know your great-grandfather, Charles Lockwood, founded the Lockwood Trust, right?" I nodded. I was his youngest daughter, the only one with enough financial sense to truly understand what he was doing. I was the first in the family to help him restructure investments back in 1981, when the market crashed. I blinked. You worked with him? She smiled faintly. I didn't just work with him. I was the only one brave enough to challenge him. He respected me for that, even if no one else in the family understood. I straightened in my seat, feeling like something sacred had just been revealed. Then why? I hesitated. Why did they cast you out? Her face remained calm. Because I did something that didn't fit their standards. I got pregnant before marriage. You were the price I had to pay. But to me, you were the only thing that was right. I bit my lip, heart pounding. You never told me about my father. She looked out the window. He's not as important as this. Then she turned back, pulling out an aged leather-bound folder from a drawer. The label read, Supplementary Trust Authority, Confidential. I took it, hands trembling slightly. This is what your grandfather left to me. A secondary trust control, activated in case the primary manager violated the ethical code, something he predicted would happen because he never trusted Clarissa. I opened the folder and saw signatures notarized nearly 20 years ago, with seals from a law office in the state of Maine. You've kept this all this time? No one knew. I didn't speak of it. I knew the moment I did they'd do everything to deny it. And I no longer had the strength for such battles. I turned to the last page where a handwritten note in violet ink, my grandfather's tilted handwriting, read, For Karen, the only one who truly understands the value of trust. I looked up, choking with emotion. So, what were you going to do with this? He held my hand. I wasn't going to use it for myself. But I signed it over to you. Just one thing. What is it? You're only allowed to use it when you feel you've been trampled enough. That line I once thought was meant to protect me. But today, as I was made into a punchline at a dinner table I had never been invited to before, I understood. It was a warning. My mother never taught me to fight others with hatred. He taught me how to wait. To wait until I was strong enough, stable enough, and wise enough to distinguish between rage and justice. I gripped the water glass tighter, the chandelier lights above reflecting in the wine like memories flowing in reverse. A voice pulled me back to the present. Ruby, what's your gift? Clarissa asked, her lips curved in that smug smile like she'd been waiting all night for this moment. I turned to her. I've redirected a portion of the profits from non-restricted assets into the Community Scholarship Division to ensure that students truly in need have access to funding. My Christmas gift is transparency. The entire table went silent. Lucas looked up from his phone, Rachel frowned, and Michael took a sip of wine, eyes locked on the tablecloth like he hoped he could disappear into it. Clarissa folded her arms. And what authority exactly do you have to do that? I smiled. As the legal co-trustee appointed by my great-grandfather and transferred to me by my mother, Karen Lockwood. A title you once dismissed because you believed she wasn't worthy. A tremor swept through the room like an invisible wave crashing ashore. But I didn't feel satisfaction. I only felt calm. Because I knew in that moment my mother's voice still echoed within me. Not the voice of a woman pushed aside by her own family, but of someone who chose to step back, so her daughter could step forward, at the right time in the right place. The clink of crystal glasses filled the room, overlaying it with a familiar, almost deceptive elegance. Beneath the gleaming chandelier, polished evening gowns, tailored suits, and sparkling small talk, it all felt like a carefully rehearsed play where every character played their role. Except me. I sat at the end of the table by the window facing the snowy garden. My deep red dress hugged gently, chosen deliberately to project confidence without theatrics. But since the moment I walked in, I could feel Clarissa's eyes scanning every detail, not because she thought I looked nice, but because she was searching for something to criticize. And then she began. Charlotte. Clarissa raised her wine glass, turning to her granddaughter with affection, just received her second full-ride scholarship from the foundation. Stanford no less. A prestigious school. Not everyone qualifies, especially now that the fund has become more selective. Rachel smiled, soft but smug. Charlotte's truly exceptional. She's accomplished more than most her age. I still have the thank you letter from the professor praising her achievements. Charlotte, 18, had her hair neatly tied back and a bright face. She smiled modestly, but her eyes sparkled with pride. I didn't dislike her. I once was her, or at least dreamed of being her. But I knew my name would soon be dragged in like always. Clarissa turned to me, tilting her head with a slight curl of her lip. And what about you, Ruby? We've heard rumors that you're doing something creative. I set my wine glass down. I run an investment fund focused on rural healthcare infrastructure. We also have a few projects connecting small businesses with emerging technology. Rachel frowned, confused. An investment fund? Like a startup? Not sure someone like Aunt Clarissa would even understand that stuff, she chuckled, turning to Charlotte. Surely not easy, Ruby, Clarissa chimed in, her voice syrupy sweet but sharp as vinegar. How long have you been at it? I thought you studied design, didn't you? Used to do graphic work for some coffee shop in Boston. Michael let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. Ruby always has interesting projects. But I've never seen her name in any major conference. Susan whispered to her husband, keep it down. Who knows? She might be freelancing as an artist. I took a sip of wine, its bitter notes spreading across my tongue. I didn't laugh. I didn't get angry. I simply looked at each of them, noting their expressions, their tone, and the gaps in their stories. The ones they tried to patch up with subtle mockery, all to hide their own insecurity. Lucas, my youngest cousin, was adjusting his bow tie. I think success is relative. Everyone has their own definition, right? I looked at him and tilted my head slightly. Of course. But real success doesn't need to diminish someone else's to shine. Clarissa set her knife down, the faint clink sounding like a blade drawn. Everyone in this family has clear goals. Charlotte has her scholarship. Rachel's built a career in education. Michael is expanding his real estate ventures. We're self-made. And you? She looked at me longer than necessary. You're Karen's daughter. Your mother had dreams once too. But nothing lasts without a strong foundation. I felt the room quiet again. The looks weren't just condescending now, they were expectant. They wanted to see how I'd react. They wanted me to explode or shrink. I did both by doing neither. I set my wine glass down and gently dabbed the rim with a napkin, like I was resetting the pace of the conversation. You're right. My mother had dreams. But unlike everyone else here, she never used others as stepping stones to get there. Rachel cleared her throat, trying to lift the mood. Let's not get too heavy. It's Christmas, right? We don't have to go that deep. Clarissa didn't stop. Not deep. Just real. Everyone in this family brings value. Contributes to our reputation. Everyone, except one. She stared at me, her eyes calm, but the cruelty beneath them didn't bother to hide. Except someone who's never played a real role. I leaned back slightly in my chair, not flinching. And what exactly is a real role? Writing checks from the fund without oversight? Or using the family name to secure scholarships for your own, even when others are more deserving? A stillness took over the room. Charlotte lowered her head, poking at cold chicken. Rachel froze. Michael reached for his wine again, but his glass was nearly empty. Clarissa chuckled. You came here tonight to lecture us all, is that it? I shook my head. No. I came because I was invited. And because you asked for a thoughtful gift. I gestured toward the box under the Christmas tree. Clarissa signaled the maid and the box was brought over. I opened the lid and pulled out a blue envelope, sealed and notarized. This is the deed confirming the transfer of ownership for this house. Purchased 3 weeks ago through a third-party firm. It's in my name now. Clarissa flinched. What are you saying? I turned to her, my voice steady. You said to bring something thoughtful. So I brought this house, because I heard the family was about to use it to back another loan from Cormont Bank. There were audible gasps. Charlotte dropped her fork. Rachel spun toward Michael. Lucas whispered, no way. So now, I said, gently sliding the envelope to the center of the table, you can continue enjoying dinner. As for the story, I'm still listening. I had barely sat back down for 2 minutes after announcing the deed transfer when Clarissa's voice pierced the air, no longer veiled, but sharp and direct like a honed blade. You living off handouts now, Ruby? Look at how you're dressed. Red silk pearl earrings. Who do you think you are? A princess? Or some kind of actress? There was a faint clatter from Charlotte's side of the table. Rachel froze, unsure whether to intervene. Michael folded his arms, eyes fixed on his wine glass like it held all the answers. I didn't react immediately. I set my glass down carefully. Clarissa went on, her voice rising now that I stayed silent. You think you're better than the rest of us, huh? With your half-baked education drifting from job to job, no husband, no kids, just sitting there playing the victim. I slowly stood up. The dinner table seemed frozen in place. I didn't look at her immediately. I bent down, opened the small handbag beside my chair and pulled out a thick folder, hard-covered, sealed in plastic, stamped by a notary and signed by 2 attorneys. I lifted the folder with both hands, then gently placed it down on the table, right in front of me. Since I was 25, I said, voice low and clear with every word, I've held co-trustee authority over the Lockwood Foundation. Clarissa froze, her brow furrowing in unmistakable confusion. What? I nodded, meeting her eyes. Great-grandfather Charles Lockwood added an appendix to his will back in 1992, allowing his youngest daughter, my mother, to hold co-signing authority if the primary trustee was ever found to have violated ethical conduct. I opened the folder to the page marked with a bright red seal. My grandfather's signature was still legible. I didn't need to explain further, just laid it there for all to see. My mother stayed silent because she believed in preserving family honor. But before she passed, she transferred that authority to me with a message. Use it only when silence is no longer a form of respect but complicity. Rachel whispered, barely breathing, Is that real? It is, I replied, eyes never leaving Clarissa. I had it legally verified last year. But I waited until the lines were truly crossed. And tonight, when you, Clarissa Lockwood, insulted me in front of the entire family by calling me a parasite, I knew it was time to stop being silent. Michael straightened in his seat. Wait, what are you saying? You can block the foundation. I turned to him, voice calm. I'm not blocking anything. I'm placing a temporary freeze on all non-community-related disbursements from the Lockwood Foundation for the year 2025, due to a violation of Ethical Clause Number 7, using the family name for personal spending, manipulating scholarships, and turning a public fund into a private tool. No one said a word. Even Susan, who'd been casually sipping her wine all evening while dropping comments about upscale restaurants, was now silent. I continued. The records in this folder are the expenses from the past year. The total, $670,000. None of it was properly audited. Every disbursement approved by one single person, Clarissa Lockwood. I glanced toward her. We'll be submitting these documents to the State Finance Board and an independent legal counsel for review. In the meantime, all new scholarship support will be paused until the audit is complete. Charlotte gasped. You mean my scholarship? I looked at my niece, softening my tone. If you deserve it, it will be reconsidered. No one is being punished. This is about clarity. You'll have the same chance as every other student. Clarissa slammed her hand on the table. You have no right to do this. You're not even real family. I turned toward her, no longer avoiding her gaze. I'm Charles Lockwood's granddaughter. Daughter of the man he trusted most. And you think you have more right than I do, just because you once lived in this house. I pointed at the envelope verifying my ownership, sitting in the middle of the table. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint, but I'm the current legal owner of this house. And as co-trustee, I have full authority to take legal action if the foundation's assets are misused. Clarissa fell silent, her face drained of color. Rachel looked stunned. Michael glanced at his wife, then down at his hands as if trying to swallow a stone. Ruby, Michael said softly, what are you going to do next? I didn't respond immediately. I scanned the room, then spoke slowly. I don't want to destroy anyone in this family. But I won't let someone like my mother be buried a second time under pride and hypocrisy. The Lockwood Foundation will be restructured. transparent, accountable. And if anyone feels they no longer belong under those new standards, they're free to step away. Silence. Long and heavy. I sat down as if completing something no one else had dared to begin. The room was devoid of soft laughter, of clinking glasses. Everything had settled into an unavoidable reckoning. I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, something no one in this room had imagined, and none of them were prepared to face. But I had been ready for a long time. And that was mine to control. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip, just to steady my breath after everything I'd just said. Outside the tall windows, the Christmas lights still shimmered like nothing had happened. But inside that elegant room, the air had thickened. Each person around the table seemed frozen, their faces pale, eyes avoiding or burning with challenge. I set the glass down, eyes still on Clarissa as she tried to muster a strained smile. She shifted in her seat, leaning slightly back as if physical distance could somehow lessen the weight of what I'd just revealed. "Booby, you're saying such heavy things. This is Christmas Eve, not a courtroom," she said, her voice trying to carry that same air of control she always used. I nodded gently, still calm. "I agree. And if this is Christmas Eve, then it's the perfect time for truth. Not silk dresses, glittering lights, or soft piano music, but true acknowledgement from the inside out." Clarissa didn't have a chance to reply before I opened the inner pocket of my handbag and pulled out a small black USB drive. I placed it on the table next to the folder, then turned to Rachel. "Do you remember 4 years ago, Rachel? When you messaged me quietly in the middle of the night? You just found out your husband was deep in debt and were terrified you wouldn't be able to keep Daniel in Princeton." Rachel froze, lips pressed tightly together. I saw her hands clenched together under the table. "You didn't tell Clarissa. Didn't tell anyone else. You only told me that you had nowhere left to turn. And I stayed silent and helped you," Rachel whispered, eyes wet. "You paid Daniel's tuition for 3 full terms. I meant to tell someone, but..." I shook my head gently. "I didn't need you to tell. I didn't do it for thanks. I just wanted everyone to understand. Sometimes the person they call useless is the one quietly holding up the cracks this family refuses to see." Michael let out a long breath. Charlotte looked between her mother, Rachel, and me, her eyes wide like a child realizing what the grown-ups had been hiding. I turned to Clarissa. "And do you remember your grandson, Nathan, the one you always bragged about to the local press? Called him a shining example for youth?" Clarissa narrowed her eyes. "He's got ideals. He's running a nonprofit." I cut her off gently. "Yes. And last year he used that title to approve 2 unauthorized withdrawals from the Lockwood Foundation, totaling $33,000, to invest in a crypto company. It collapsed within 6 weeks. The entire room went still. I opened the folder, pulling out 2 account statements and a bank transaction reconciliation copy. I discovered this when I happened to review documents sent to the secondary audit committee. I chose not to make it public, to protect the family's reputation. I covered the deficit myself from my personal account. Clarissa's face went pale. "You're making this up." I remained calm. "If I were, you could sue. But before you do, I want to play a short recording. Just a brief one." I plugged the USB into a small portable speaker I had brought just in case and pressed play. The sound filled the air, the room silent as stone. She's a useless brat dragging the Lockwood name straight into the dirt. Karen's daughter. Of course she's trash, just like her mother. A woman pregnant without a husband thinks she deserves a share? That's laughable. I turned off the speaker. No one spoke. Clarissa's face drained completely, her lips trembling as she looked around the room. Rachel lowered her head. Charlotte was silent. Michael closed his eyes. I looked around the table. This recording was made 6 years ago, when I submitted my application to join the Lockwood Trust Council. I don't know who recorded it, but I received it 2 months after I was rejected for lack of character. And when I heard your voice in it, I chose silence. Not because I was weak, but because I wasn't ready to give up the last bit of faith I had in so-called family ties. Clarissa shot up from her chair, the screech of wood on marble cutting the air. You came here to slander this family? I stood firm, my gaze steady. No. I came to tell the truth. To end the chain of silence forced on people like my mother, Karen Lockwood, who quietly built the financial backbone of this foundation but was crushed for not fitting the mold you created. I bowed my head slightly as if closing a chapter. I don't want to humiliate anyone. But from now on, if someone asks why the Lockwood Foundation must change, I'll answer. Because it's time fairness is restored to its rightful place. No one objected. No one left. Only faces staring back as if seeing themselves in an honest mirror. And I, after years of being cast as a shadow, was finally seen. Not because I shouted, but because the truth had spoken. The room had become a smoldering battlefield, where family honor was stripped away layer by layer like stinging onion skins. The clatter of spoons, the angry whispers, the scraping of chairs. Every sound seemed doubled in that room designed to perform artificial happiness. Rachel was the first to break the silence. Her voice no longer calm but trembling, shaken and wounded. Mom, she turned to Clarissa, her lips quivering. All these years you told me, my scholarship was earned because I deserved it because of my ability. And now I find out it was Ruby, who signed off on the funding. Clarissa pressed her lips tight, eyes darting away. Rachel leaned closer to her mother, voice rising with emotion. Answer me. Did you lie? My whole youth, I believed I'd achieved something on my own. And now I learn everything I had was tied to the very person you've despised. Rachel, you don't understand anything, Clarissa snapped, her voice cracking. I did it to protect you. You needed a chance. And she jabbed her finger at me. She had nothing to lose. I stayed silent, letting her words slice through the fragile illusion of peace around the table. The chandeliers still glittered. The Christmas tree still stood tall and proud, as if it hadn't heard the venom ripping through the hearts of everyone present. Protect me. Rachel's laugh was bitter. By turning someone else into the dumping ground for every truth you refused to face? Do you know how many nights I cried thinking I wasn't good enough? Not worthy? When the one who truly lifted me up was the very person you called worthless. Clarissa slammed her palm on the table, knocking her wine glass onto its side, dark red liquid spreading across the cloth like blood. She's a disgrace. She doesn't belong in this family. She's the product of a mistake Father tried to cover with pity. I raised my head, meeting her eyes. And you think you're saving family tradition by staging a theater of lies? No, Aunt Clarissa. I'm not destroying tradition. I'm saving it. Saving it from rotting from the inside out. Clarissa gasped, her face ghostly white, her hands clutching the back of her chair as if to hold herself up. I heard a faint rasp in her breath. Her eyes widened. Aunt Clarissa? Rachel cried out, rushing to her. Mom, are you okay? Clarissa's hand clutched her chest, trembling violently. She collapsed back into her chair, lips moving but no sound escaping. I stepped from my seat immediately without hesitation. Charlotte, call 911. Your grandmother has a history of high blood pressure. It's likely a heart attack. Charlotte's hands shook, but she fumbled for her phone quickly. I moved closer to Clarissa, kneeling calmly, checking her breathing and tapping her arm gently to keep her conscious. Everyone else scrambled. Rachel hovered by her mother, her face drained of all color. Michael grabbed a wet cloth to dab her forehead. Through it all, I kept my voice steady, clear, and controlled. We need to get her off the chair, onto the floor, lying on her side to keep her airway open. Michael helped me lower her down, slowly. Michael said nothing, only followed my lead. When Clarissa was lowered onto the floor, I folded my coat into a makeshift pillow and placed it under her head. Her breathing was heavy but steady. I looked at Charlotte. Has the ambulance arrived yet? 3 more minutes. Charlotte shouted. I held Clarissa's hand, my gaze calm. And if you can still hear me, listen closely. I didn't come here to give you a heart attack. But I also didn't come here to keep pretending everything is fine. I'm no longer the timid 16-year-old girl. Clarissa tried to open her eyes. A tear welled at the corner of her wrinkled eye, trailing down her cheek. I didn't know if it was regret, fear, or just a reflex of the body. But I no longer expected an apology. No longer expected her to call me a granddaughter in the truest sense. I stood when the wail of sirens echoed through the gates. I stepped back, giving space for the paramedics rushing in. Michael guided them inside, Rachel still clutching her mother's hand. I stepped to the back of the room, quietly gathering the USB and the folder, then stood like a stranger observing a family peeling off the mask they had once glued on so tightly. When Clarissa was lifted onto the stretcher, her eyes met mine one last time. No blame. No hatred. No forgiveness. Just the look of someone finally forced to face the consequences of what she had sown. The next morning, I walked into the law office with 2 representatives from the independent auditing firm I had secretly contracted 3 weeks earlier. Everything was prepared, waiting only for one final signature to launch the full audit of the Lockwood Foundation. I still remember the silence in that meeting room when I declared, with a voice not raised but carrying enough weight to halt everyone. Starting today, all personal disbursements from the Lockwood Foundation will be suspended for 1 year. During that time, we will conduct a full audit of every expense and every grant from the past 5 years. And this will not be an internal review. I've contracted Grant Avery, the leading independent audit firm in the Northeast. Some froze in shock, others paled. Rachel lowered her head, silent. Michael looked at me as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. But I didn't waver. I had spent nearly 2 months preparing for this moment, and I wouldn't let anyone shake me. I hadn't come to take revenge. I had come to repair the foundation. Days later, the atmosphere in the Lockwood estate had completely changed. No more loud laughter, no more bragging, no more selfies with the grand Christmas tree. Instead, phone calls flooded in from relatives who once called me a shadow. Rachel was the first to show up. She knocked on my office door, the one that used to be my grandfather's library, her face unlike its usual self. No heavy makeup, no prideful stare, just a cousin perched on the edge of her chair, fingers twisting nervously. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Rachel's voice was small, nearly a whisper. I nodded but kept my distance. "I'm listening." I didn't know you were the one who approved my scholarship. If I had known earlier, maybe I would have acted differently. I raised my eyes to hers. "The issue isn't whether you knew. It's whether, without me, you'd have ever asked why you were chosen. Or would you have simply believed you deserved it more than others, because you were Aunt Clarissa's daughter?" Rachel bit her lip. I just want to say I'm sorry. And, if there's any way I can help with the audit, just tell me. I don't want to run away. I nodded, polite but firm. "I'll note your apology. As for helping, that's up to you. But don't do it to erase guilt. Do it if you truly want to change how this family operates." After Rachel came Michael. Then 2 relatives from Philadelphia. Each tried to approach me, the one they once called the child born out of wedlock, Karen's youthful disgrace. I received them all. But there were no handshakes, no embraces. I invited them to sit, listened, and took notes. "Can you give me the chance to explain why my grant doubled last year?" one cousin asked. "I'll let the audit firm send you an inquiry if they deem it necessary," I replied curtly. "Dear, would you consider extending the funding for the Equestrian Training Center in Vermont? We're entering winter," one uncle began. I looked at him. "That center has reported deficits 3 consecutive years, with operating costs triple comparable facilities. If you have different data, submit it before the 10th of next month." I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was simply doing what my mother once taught me. Keep your spine straight and your eyes open. A week later, I convened the first meeting of the Temporary Trust Council. But this time I didn't sit in the back, where Clarissa once silenced me for lacking qualifications. I sat in the center chair. And I was the one who spoke first. I propose restructuring the Lockwood Foundation Council into a transparent model, with at least half the members from outside the family. We will prioritize those with expertise in finance, community education, and social welfare. There were murmurs, doubtful glances. An older member asked, "Are you trying to remove family altogether?" I smiled. No. I want them in their rightful place as contributors, not owners. This foundation was created to serve the community, not to uphold the status of an aging bloodline. I presented a 3-year financial analysis. Compared the percentage of funding that actually reached community programs to internal operating costs. The shocking truth: less than 18% of the budget reached those in need. I didn't create these numbers. This is the result of letting bloodlines and pride outweigh responsibility. A woman from a local nonprofit whom I'd invited to the trial council stood up. "If you follow through with this plan, I believe Lockwood could become a model foundation for this region." I bowed my head in thanks. The meeting ended in a strange silence. No applause. No congratulations. But I didn't need that. All I needed was a family, even if not by blood, brave enough to start again with truth. And perhaps step by step I was rebuilding that family. Not from bricks or mortar, but from responsibility, from trust, from respect, the very thing stripped from me for over 20 years. The late December sky glowed a soft orange, the air crisp but gentler than the year before. I stood at the 8th floor window of the new headquarters, the restructured Lockwood Foundation, watching the rush of people below, Christmas music drifting from a cafe across the street. In my hands was a mug of hot cocoa made by my assistant. 1 year had passed. Yet every moment from that Christmas Eve remained etched in me, like a carving on oak. I turned around and slowly walked into the warmly decorated, simple room. A Christmas tree nearly 10 feet tall stood in the corner, adorned with paper stars made by children from an orphanage in Queens, the very first project of the foundation after restructuring. Soft golden light fell on the faces of those talking and laughing. Not loud, not ostentatious, just people I trusted, cherished, and chose to walk beside. There was Marcus, my boyfriend, helping a young volunteer adjust boxes of homemade cookies. There was Mr. Jonathan, my seasoned legal advisor, smiling kindly by the buffet table, chatting with new members of the Foundation Council. There were staff who had stuck with me since the early hard days, and even some who once doubted but had chosen to return. And there was Rachel. She had arrived early, wrapped in a thick navy coat, her hair neatly tied back. No makeup, no high heels, no designer handbag like before. She walked up to me, stood silently for a few seconds, then softly spoke. "Ruby, I know you're busy, but may I say a few words?" I set my glass down and nodded. "I'm listening." Rachel gently squeezed her leather gloves in her hands. "This past year I joined 3 volunteer projects with the foundation. I no longer receive funding, no longer hold privileges. I've been just another contributor like anyone else. But that's what made me realize the true value of giving isn't in a name on a plaque, but in grateful eyes and tight embraces from those who receive." I looked at her, my eyes no longer guarded. "I know you've tried. I also know you've changed." Rachel bowed her head, her voice small. "I'm sorry for everything I said before. I thought being a Lockwood gave me the right to feel above others. But the Lockwood name I once took pride in was nothing more than a mask." I lightly touched her hand. "I don't need endless apologies. I need you to keep doing meaningful work. If you still want to stay with the foundation, I'll officially invite you to coordinate the education project in Newark." Rachel's eyes widened, then filled with tears. "You'd really let me?" I smiled. "You've been chosen. Not because of family, but because you've earned it." She hugged me quickly, a wordless, sincere embrace. A little later, my assistant handed me an ivory envelope, saying it had been delivered that morning. I opened it and found a simple Christmas card, no sender listed on the front. Inside, handwritten in familiar blue ink, were the words, "Ruby, though I don't agree with everything you've done, I must admit, you've accomplished what very few in this family ever had the courage to do: question, unearth, and rebuild from the ground up. Thank you for not giving up. Clarissa." I folded the card gently, saying nothing. My heart didn't tremble with emotion, nor soften with forgiveness. But I felt lighter, as if for the first time I had finally acknowledged myself. Clarissa was still Clarissa. She might never change completely, but at least she no longer denied. I turned back into the room where people were gathering around the tree. Marcus pulled me close, his arm around my shoulder. "A long year, huh?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Long. But necessary. You did what most people spend a lifetime too afraid to even imagine. You chose truth, you chose justice, over silence and convenience." I smiled, my eyes gliding over the faces in the room. A new kind of family, not bound by blood, but held together by kindness and responsibility. A young staff member carried over a tray of hot chocolate, chirping as she asked if I wanted extra marshmallows. I laughed, nodded, took a cup and stepped near the window. The glow of the Christmas tree reflected in the glass, twinkling like 1,000 tiny stars. I remembered those winter nights long ago, when I was just a girl, never named on family cards, never given a seat at the table, never asked what I thought or dreamed. I once wished for a day I could stand in the light without lowering my head or hiding. And now here I was, not under stage lights, not in the noise of applause, but among people I had chosen, and who had chosen me in return. I was no longer the shadow in the Lockwood mansion, no longer the illegitimate child. I was Ruby, a woman who dared to stand in the storm and find her way to peace. I hadn't saved a tradition. I had begun a new journey, where tradition was purified, where dignity came first, where people were valued not for their name but for who they truly were. And I knew that journey had only just begun. And what about you? If you were me on that Christmas Eve, standing under the weight of scornful eyes, holding the truth in your hands, would you have the courage to speak to end generations of silence? Would you choose to stay quiet to keep a seat at the table, or would you rise to rebuild one worth sitting at? I don't believe every journey requires noise or revenge. Sometimes the strongest answer is living with more grace than they ever thought you could. My story may not be yours, but I believe somewhere out there are people struggling to protect their peace within a family full of pressure. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own home, remember, you have the right to redefine what family means. If this story touched something in you, share your thoughts below. I want to listen, not as the main character but as someone who's walked through darkness to find the light. And if you want more stories about family, pride, and choices, subscribe to the channel. Because this journey doesn't end here. Many more stories wait to be told, raw, moving, and sometimes making us reflect on ourselves. See you in the next story.